For today's podcast, it's time for another board recap podcast. Dr. Smith, we're going to go through the school board meeting from last night, but coincidentally enough, we had a board meeting last night and it just happened to be, I'll call it the first day of school now that we do the soft start. So you want to just talk to us for a second? Let's recap maybe our first morning. We got off to a great start.
You know, it really was a great day for us. The weather, I don't think cooperated a whole lot. A little rainy. I think when I finally made it home about 8 o'clock last night or Monday night, I think I was still wet. So
Right,
it was a soggy morning, but our folks handled it like troopers. So appreciate parent understanding and our student understanding. But
the students were troopers. They had their rain jackets on, their
right.
umbrellas, and it didn't seem to break their spirit at all, even though it was pouring down.
So it's good to see everybody back.
Yeah. And I think, and I know you were in a lot of schools, I was too, all of us were, and just you can sense that energy, and just hats off to our employees. I mean, they do everything they can to make that a special moment to welcome kids back, whether it's kindergartners or all the way through high school.
Yep. It's always remember your first day.
Yes, definitely. So, of course, we have another first day, if you will, on Wednesday morning for the second half of the alphabet. We look forward to everyone being together on Friday morning. So,
and the soft start really it's a great thing for our students, for our staff. I know sometimes it can be an inconvenience for parents, but the relationships that teachers can make in those first few formative days, because they have very very small class sizes, leads to success throughout the entire school year.
Sure. And I think it is a little less intimidating for students, whether they're younger or even older.
Right.
We all get a case of the nerves sometime on the first day of school, and just less numbers means just a little more relaxed environment.
Absolutely.
So it's a great thing. So we'll dive in last night. I'll just start with good news. I just kind of went through and recap for board members recent recipients of our cause for applause. That's our employees of the month. Again, hats off to them. We always enjoy celebrating them. We've added their names to the plaque that hangs in the administration building. So I know we look forward to starting that off again this year.
Yes, we do. Those are always among my very favorite things to do throughout the school year.
Right. Very well-deserved recognition for those employees. So if you would, Dr. Smith, we had quite a few consent items. If you want to take us through that.
Certainly. We'll skip the minutes of the July 26th meeting, dive into the allowance of payments, which is item 2.02. And we had an allowance of payments of $6.9 million, which is actually much lighter than it typically is. But our pay in the summer months is just a little bit smaller than when we are in session. We'll look at 2.03. That's the consideration of the adoption of preliminary bond resolution and the reimbursement resolution. This is for $6.5 million general obligation bond, and we use those funds really for safety and security, for site improvements, for renovations, for HVAC upgrades, those types of things. So this is part of the legal process that we have to undertake in order to issue those bonds. Item 2.04 then, consideration to approve the copy paper bid. I believe the RFP went out, which is a request for proposal, went out to 17 vendors that provide copy paper. There was one response to the RFP, and that was submitted by Allstott. And the price is going up slightly per case, from $32 per case to $34 per case. And they're holding that for 12 months. And we do appreciate their service, and it is for desktop delivery, which is very
we really get good
valuable.
service from
Yes.
them.
So appreciate their service to our schools. Item 2.05, consideration to approve grant proposals. These are 3 grant proposals. They are all either state or federal grant proposals. 2 go to the Indiana Department of Education for the formative assessment grant, and the dollar amount per student will be determined once all of the school corporations across the state have submitted their request for this, and the state then helps us pay for assessments that we provide our students. Non-English speaking program grant, that is a grant that we are blessed to receive. This will be $315,000 for this upcoming year. And then Title III federal funds, and those are also for limited English proficient students.
And we've said before, I mean, that is certainly a growing segment over the years, substantial growth in that segment of our student population. And with all the sports we're able to provide, really the growth of those students is just phenomenal, is the only way to say it.
Yes, and our staff that deal with those youngsters do a great job.
Mhm.
Imagine not really speaking English, but yet everyone around you does, and that can
Yeah.
be a very intimidating situation. So,
And we do have some students that come in and truly speak basically zero English,
yes,
and in a remarkable short amount of time, they're not only speaking, but they're participating in class because, of course, that's the expectation. They're not just learning the language, they're also learning and continuing on with academics like their peers.
if we know anything, kids are very adaptive and they do
Definitely.
pick up a very difficult language very early on.
Yes.
Moving on to 2.06, which is consideration to enter into another contract with NWA. This, as are several under consent existing contracts. So individuals can read the description that they find in board docs. But we use the MAP, which is measures of academic progress for growth in grades K through 2, and then in 3 through 10 for assessments that are going to be used for our RTI program. Moving on to 2.07, we're blessed to still have the services of Susan McDowell Riley. She has a very specific license, which is a health service provider and psychology license, and that allows us then to bill for Medicaid. We provide a lot of services for students, and she oversees that with our individual providers, and grateful that she continues to oversee that work. And this is a contract then providing for that. When we look at 2.08, consideration to approve the academic evaluator contracts for 3 individuals, we do this on an annual basis because when we have individuals that are undergoing educational evaluations and assessments for qualifications for special education services, that is a very time bound process. And this makes certain, these individuals make certain that they can level the load in case the number of evaluations exceeds our capacity within that time frame.
Absolutely, and that is something that we take very, very seriously. You have to meet those certain deadlines of that through that process.
Absolutely. And then the next three, item 2.09 through 2.11, are all vendors that we currently have under contract. So this is just a renewal of those 3 contracts.
Okay, and that takes us through consent items, and then, of course, we have, as we always do, personnel recommendations, but I know that's listed, as you always say, for anyone who
Absolutely.
wants to check that out.
So individuals can click on that if you would like. Moving on to action 2.04, consideration to approve the policy of 8510, which is our wellness policy. Uh, I believe that that was reviewed before when we had the information section for the last board meeting update.
Yes.
So it was approved last night. Something that was not on the agenda previously, which is the consideration of the naming of the EVSC Central High School football field at Central Stadium for Mike Owen.
Yeah, talk to us about that for a second because that really is special, especially to individuals who went through Central High School on the north side. Definitely a very important name to them.
Mike, just a phenomenal individual, taken from this earth far too soon. Many of the folks I think know his parents, Archie and Louise Owen, who were pillars in the community, not just the coaching community, but in the Evansville community for working with young adults and providing for them a way forward to have an outstanding life. And Mike certainly followed in his parents' footsteps, coached football and tennis at Central for a long time, was a 42-year veteran of EVSC schools. So
And the hallmark of any great educator is certainly Mike was known for his coaching, as you said, in those two sports, football and tennis. But I think he had an impact on just about as many students as he did student athletes, students at Central High School who never even considered playing sports, still through his classes, really did. He connected with his students, whether they were an athlete or not.
absolutely, they all knew Mike and they love Mike, and I think that
Right.
there can be no finer tribute. And
Right. But
Mike's
with his coaching, having his name
absolutely,
on that football
yeah.
field is right where it
Yeah,
should be.
and then there will also be a plaque on the tennis court. So this is a way for EVSC to honor individuals that really did exemplify the highest values of EVSC. So pleased that the football field at Central Stadium will be named in honor of Mike Owen.
Without a doubt. And then moving in information items, let's do this if you would, Dr. Smith. Let's go ahead and look at 5.01 and 5.03, and then we'll come back and do just kind of an overview of the budget presentation lastly, if you would. So if you want to
Certainly.
start.
Item 5.01, consideration approve the policy 0164.15, which is electronic participation by board members in board meetings. Um, the law that had been on the books was rather archaic, so this is an update to this. And basically, the short version is that if board members remote in only via telephone, then they can participate, but they cannot vote. So a board member can only vote if they can be seen on the screen when the vote is being taken, and then the vote has to be done through roll call. I think it's just another way to ensure very transparent
Sure.
operation of school board meetings. And these really are not just for school board meetings. This particular policy is, but really these are for any any board meeting that's held in the public by an elected official
So a good
in
example
Indiana.
would be if someone can't be here, but they connect via WebEx or Zoom, for example, and we can actually see them and hear them, then they can actually participate, including voting, just as if they were in the boardroom.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
If you want to jump to 5.03.
Yes, the Voya transition. This was a 6 month process. So that was actually, I think, 8 years in the making. But hats off to our HR and our business office, as well as to the good folks at the Evansville Teachers Federal Credit Union, for working with us to transition all of our employees' retirement and investments over to the credit union. The service that the credit union will provide, I know, will be stellar. They've dedicated individuals solely to EVSC. And I also know that the fees that will be charged to our employees for their investments are also going to be less. So the service will go up, the cost to employees is less, and this is a win for everybody.
This is not the first time we've talked about just the support we receive and what a powerful partner Evansville Teachers Federal Credit Union is to the EVSC.
You're correct.
And now let's go back. So 5.02, Dr. Carl Underwood, who actually was on a recent podcast, who's our assistant superintendent for business operations, did a presentation. This always follows a certain format and timeline when a new budget is presented. So in this case, this was the first time of taking a look at the 2022 budget. So we're going to pull that up on the screen, some of his slides. And if you would, I know you're extremely familiar with all this with your background. So you want to talk to us and share some highlights of this presentation?
Certainly. So there's really a standard format in presenting the budget to your school board because things, while they did change about 3 years ago, going to an education fund and an operations fund, primarily schools are funded through a variety of mechanisms, primarily being driven by state contributions to our budget. And then also we have property tax that also contributes to a part. So I'll try my best to delineate
Sure.
those. But if we go on into the second slide, you can see that the board approval is required for the education fund, the operations fund, the rainy day fund, and then our debt service and exempt debt service fund. So this is all laid out in statute. So the board is required to approve these funds.
So the steps you're taking us through, really any school district in the state of Indiana, any public district, really follows this same format and these same steps.
Correct. So then in the next slide, we make the basic assumption that enrollment projections are going to remain very stable. We're not projecting that they go up, not projecting that they go down, because this gives us a better apples to apples comparison of year over year budget.
Yeah, you don't want to just take a random guess in the dark and say we're going to have 300 more kids and build your budget on that.
Correct. So then the next slide really gets into, in the next several slides, talk about the education fund revenue. I think it's important to understand that, once again, we have the education fund, we have the operations fund. Education fund is funded, if you will, through the basic tuition support that the state provides. So basically, in 4 categories, it's basic tuition support and the complexity index grant, which complexity index stands for basically students that are on free and reduced lunch and those factors. Then a calculation for the number of students in honors, diplomas, as well as special education, as well as vocational education. Once again, those are the revenue components of the education fund. So on the next slide, you see the breakdown of those funding mechanisms: the basic tuition support and complexity grant, would be about 153 million. You can see those dollar amounts listed for a total amount of state support, which would be $169,209,210. So then when you move forward, when we look at the education revenue total for that fund, we have the basic grant amount, which I just listed, and then miscellaneous state and local revenue. That could be transfer tuition or fees or things like that.
And this,
Um,
by the way, Indiana has changed this in recent years. This is where the bulk of the funding hits, correct, on the basic grant side. Is that a fair way of saying it? As opposed
yes,
to property taxes.
correct.
Okay.
The state actually changed that, I believe, in 2009,
Okay.
where there was communities actually varied in the percentage of property tax funds that were used to support. At the time, it was called the general fund.
Okay.
About 3 years back, they changed it from the general fund to the education fund, and then part of the education fund, if you would, revenue, then has to go to expenses that are now attributed in the operations fund.
Yeah.
So I hope that's not too confusing, but
No.
the joke used to be that there were only two people in the state of Indiana that understood school budgets, and they were never allowed to travel together. So I think sometimes this is made
Right.
overly complicated. We try to simplify it.
And it does speak, though, to the expertise required for people like our individuals in our business office and our finance team to make sure we're following everything we need to do to build a sound budget and do it the way Indiana spells it out in statute.
Correct. And as I laid out at the beginning, we're basically talking about fund accounting. So when people say, well, why can't you pay your teachers more out of whatever fund? By law, we can only pay teachers out of the education fund.
Okay.
It's not that we can pay teachers out of operations or raise property taxes to pay teachers more. Okay. So then moving on, uh, so the previous 3 or 4 slides were about how we get revenue into the education fund. Now we're going to talk about what are those permissible expenses in the education fund. So the expenditures then are basically in two categories: academic achievement as well as student support. And the examples you can see on the screen be teachers, principals, counselors, and the like. Okay. What is always fascinating, I think, for the public to see is that 98% of our education fund expenditures go to salary, wages, and fringe benefits. Once again, 98%, 98% goes to salary, wages, and fringe
As
benefits.
I've heard you say many times, this is a people based organization, and the bulk of the money goes to the people that it takes to run this organization.
Absolutely. And we've said many, many, many times we are very benefit rich. So when you see that salaries and wages account for 103 million, but yet fringe benefits are 41.2 million, we spend a lot of money on health insurance each and every year, and the bulk of that, as well as other fringe benefits, then make up what I think is a pretty sizable amount uh, of funding.
Sure.
When we then go on now to the property tax driven fund. So, once again, what we've been talking about prior to this moment is revenue that is provided by the state. Now, these funds receive their revenue from property taxes in Vanderbilt County. So, operations fund are funded, as I said, through property tax. And then there are other lesser miscellaneous taxes that you can see on the screen: motor vehicle, commercial vehicle excise tax, financial institutions tax, and then some local revenue sources as well as education fund transfers. This is new for just 3 years ago because the state still, through the basic grant, puts all the money into the education fund, but they have moved some of the expenses that used to be in that fund into the operations fund. And that's why we now have to transfer money, about $22 million a year, into the operations fund because the state transferred the expense to the operations
I
fund.
think anyone listening is picking up on the fact that this system is created, but it is constantly evolving, it sounds like, to somebody who's not maybe an extra expert in this. And so it's incumbent on us and our finance team to obviously stay up to speed on these changes every single year, because you certainly can't just continue to operate the way you always have, or you're not going to be going through the budget in the way it's now spelled out.
Certainly agree. And I think that the impact of statutory changes was never felt in a more prevalent manner than this year when all of the object codes for all of our employees were changed effective July 1st, and we have to deliver a budget in a timely manner. So we had to change object codes for 3,400 employees. Uh, and because there's a new statute that said 45% of the education fund had to go to teacher salaries. And in order to arrive at that calculation, everything had to be changed in terms of the accounting mechanism. So, quite a bit of work by very few people, but that I think is a prime example of how things continue to change. Now, getting back into the PowerPoint, when you look at the operations fund and the revenue sources, as I said before, the education fund primary source of revenue was from the state. You can see now that the four different revenue sources, number one big driver is from property taxes, $45 million worth, and miscellaneous tax, and then local revenue sources. That's through a variety of means, including fees. And then once again, the education fund transfers that I alluded to earlier because the education fund expenses have been transferred to operations fund. So then moving on to the next slide, all of these expenses fall in category primarily three because I don't know that we have hardly any that are non-operational, but the examples would include in the operations fund, operations as well as daycare, insurance, utilities, things like that. And that would be insurance like property and casualty, as well as our self-insurance and health insurance for those individuals that are paid out of the operations fund. So now this is a pie chart for what it looks like in operations, where we had 98% of expenditures in the education fund were attributed to people. This is a little bit lower. You can see that it is a total of 68%. But then we also have supplies, so utilities, all of those other things that do come out of the operations.
And I think an interesting thing about this too is for especially for a district our size, as large as we are. Of course, when you think employees, you tend to think of those most obvious things, the teachers, the principals in the schools. But there are so many individuals that are in non-teaching type positions on that operation side that are extremely valuable, and we have to have them in place to keep all of the things running that it takes for a school district our size.
Absolutely. When we put our student population together with our staff, we're about the 30th largest city in Indiana. So when you think of what it takes for a city to run, certainly teachers are paramount importance. We also have administrators, but we also have bus drivers to
Mhm.
get kids to school. We also have bus mechanics to make certain that our buses are in tip-top shape, food service to make certain kids are fed. We have classroom assistants. We have so many people that if you just stop to think about it, well, yeah, schools need to be clean. The grass needs to be cut. Need to be kept on. So we have electricians, we have plumbers, we have nurses, we have everything that a small city would have.
Which is really why for us, so often we refer to our team as our staff. We don't
Right.
necessarily just use the generic term of our teachers. Of course, they do a phenomenal job, but it really takes everyone to make a school district successful.
It clearly does. Clearly does. So now looking on to the next budget, if you would, that is really found inside the operations fund would be the capital projects fund. And that is a requirement from state to be a 3-year plan. And really it's for construction improvements as well as equipment and technology. So we are certainly a proponent of technology, and we were blessed to have that foresight, I think, as a district many, many years ago when the pandemic hit. We were able to shift and turn on a dime and use the blessing of technology to keep our kids educated in the spring of 20 when we were no longer allowed to attend school.
Always an important part of our academics, but never felt maybe as strongly and as such an urgent manner as last year.
Yeah. So one of the things that I could have mentioned previously, we have, I think, more wireless access points and more devices on a network than anybody else south of Indianapolis. Well, it takes a lot of technicians to keep that up, IT support. Those things don't just happen without the expertise and the human capital, the people to make those devices continue and keep them in good shape and help them
Yeah,
continue
some of
to
those
run.
things we take for granted almost. There's a lot that goes on behind the scenes.
We absolutely do. I think now, whenever any one of our students or faculty opens up their laptop at school, they expect it to turn on and they expect the connectivity to the internet, just like when you turn on a light switch,
Mhm.
you expect it to come on. So I think that's how far we've come, and our folks do, once again, a great job. We are truly, truly blessed. Um, Also, in capital projects, just a little bit more detail. You can see the breakdown of the dollar cost in all of this. You can see in the bottom line where if you add up all of those totals, it would come to $29.7 million. The reality is that we will not receive anything close to that.
I'm going to stop you. Talk to us about that because every year when we go through this, I hear you say that. And I think for many people, they might hear that and think, what are you talking about? The numbers in the budget. So why is it you can't expect that?
Right. Well, when we look at everything below really lease and purchase. So utilities, technology, equipment, skill, labor, emergency, those are things that we know that we are going to spend. So then that leaves very little room at the top, if you will, for things that we also really need to spend money on, not would like, but need to. We have 5 million square feet under roof. The best industry best practice says then you really need to generate um, an improvement, an upgrade account of 25 million on an annual basis just to take care of that. And Daryl Angermeyer does a phenomenal job, as do all of our facility folks. He's a chief facility officer, but he really only receives about $3 to $4 million for what industry experts say should be $25 million worth of potential upgrades on an annual basis. So we know we will not receive that much because capital projects is a fixed rate levy, which means that we will not get any more than the property tax from the previous year allowed us to do with a growth quotient. So that is a fixed amount. Even though we have a need for more, we will never receive more.
And it's certainly not as easy as saying this year we would like more. It doesn't work that
It
way.
does not work that way. Moving on to another fund in the operations fund is really the transportation fund, if you will. It's broken out into two areas. One is the operating fund. That budget's 16.2 million. And then the bus replacement fund, you can see once again that's a $16 million fund, but it's based upon a 5-year replacement plan. That was changed several years ago from 12 years to 5 years. Not certain why that changed, because our buses are in great shape and they can run a long time because of our outstanding mechanics. But because you have a 5-year replacement plan, that makes it an abnormally high budget. Once again, we will not receive that amount, and you will see in just a moment what I'm talking about. But in the next slide, you have the number of buses that are eligible for replacement within that 5-year plan listed and in that dollar amount. So then moving on, the next two slides, actually, the first one being Art Institute, and then the second, which is the Bossy Field Historical Society, they are very, very similar in nature. It is a half a penny per $100 of assessed valuation. So that for the average home would be about $5. The budget, once again, is 375,000, but by the time you take property tax and, or I'm sorry, the property tax caps
Apps,
into
right?
consideration, that number is lowered significantly, as is, as I said, with Historical Society. And then moving on, then when we look at debt, we have regular debt service as well as exempt debt. Actually, the 22 expenditure budget has lowered from the 21 budget for the regular debt service because we have now paid off the Career and Tech Center. But when you look at the next slide for the exempt debt, the debt schedules actually contemplated the Career and Tech Center being finished, and then they brought on that same amount of debt into the exempt. So when you put those two budgets together, there's been really no movement over 2 years. It's just been changed somewhat within the two individual budgets, but the total effect is still the same amount. And then moving on to the rainy day fund, I know sometimes this causes some confusion. These are funds that we already have. We're not asking for more money here. Funds actually come into the rainy day fund uh, as we have been able to save out of other budgets.
So the money we're looking at here, the 8.4 million is money that we've already accumulated. This
Correct.
is not 8.4 million that you're just assuming we're going to move over in 2022.
No, but the reason why we put this in the budget process is that we need the authority to spend those funds. Um, we so you can have the money in the fund, but if you don't have the authority or the permission to spend the money, then you can't utilize it. So we look at the rainy day fund as an emergency fund if something should come up. The authorization process to get approval to spend money out of those funds is about a 6-week process. So we just think it's prudent to ask for the ability to spend funds out of that fund should the need arise during the
And
entire
when you
budget
say the
process.
authority, you're talking about our locally elected school board, our 7 trustees.
Right. And the authority actually comes from the Department of Local Government Finance.
Okay.
So they're the ones, the board has to approve the budget and then it's submitted to the Department of Local Government Finance. They review and then give us our budget order, which is called a 1782 notice.
Okay.
And then on this slide, which is really a recap, and then you'll see on a couple spots where we have the advertised budget and then really where we will have the anticipated funding come in. So when you look at capital projects fund, you'll see that $29.7 million advertised budget, but we only expect to get about 18.4 million, which is a substantial 11.3 million dollar difference is a substantial
Mhm.
difference. And then once again, I would highlight the bus replacement fund. Um, Instead of the 16 million advertised budget, we're likely going to get 2.2 million. And then once again, as we were just talking about the rainy day fund, we're not asking for money into that. We're just asking for permission to spend. That's why the anticipated funding for the rainy day fund is at 0.
And so, really, when you look at that last row of that total, when you look at a school district our size for the EVSC, you're looking at the 2022 budget of just under $250 million.
Yeah, so I think what tells a very compelling story is the next slide because when you look at the 5 largest school districts in Indiana, you will see EVSC has by far the most favorable tax rate. So let's put this in terms that I think make a lot of sense. If you look at a house, for instance, in MSD Perry Township in Marion County,
Which is just
in
out in the
Indianapolis,
outskirts of
right?
Indianapolis.
When you look at that township school district, their tax rate is 1.5341, which means that a house after you put in homestead exemption, all everything else, if their net evaluation came out to $100,000, the property tax responsibility for that household would be $1,534. However, in Vanderbilt County, if you have a net assessed valuation home of $100,000, your property tax responsibility would be $938. So a significant difference. That's why those property tax rates are so important. And we are the lowest among the 5 largest districts in Indiana, and we have been traditionally for many, many years. And we have an excellent bond rating also. So I hope the public um, can see that we are very good stewards of the public's wealth, and we take that responsibility very, very seriously. And then when you look at the final steps for the budget, all this is laid out in statute. You can see what happens on August the 23rd, the 25th, the 7th, and then September the 20th.
And so then on September 20th, which is our second school board meeting in the month of September, that is when things are slated to happen in terms of the board actually then voting to approve this
Yes.
budget.
So it's a very lengthy process that actually begins crafting the budget in February. Then, before this is presented to the board publicly, we had individual board sessions where board members can ask questions and get more comfortable with their budget because it is a very complex task and undertaking. And then it was presented on August the 9th, and then there will be about 6 weeks before the board actually votes to approve.
And I know I've heard you say as a superintendent, you have certainly found during your tenure that elected board members take this responsibility of this oversight of the budget of funding and expenditures very, very seriously. I mean, this is one of the things that they are in office to accomplish.
Absolutely. And, as I think an awareness that has been raised from our board recap podcast, at least once a month, updated figures are provided, financial figures are provided to the board for their perusal.
Okay. Well, we know we spent quite a bit of time on that, but we felt like it was important. There was time spent at the board meeting last night when Dr. Underwood presented this as well. So hopefully this helps people. It is rather complicated, but you can certainly listen to this to just get kind of a basic understanding of what we're dealing with in terms of how we put it together a budget and make projections for the upcoming school years. So
It is an ongoing work, yes.
well, we appreciate you going through that, Dr. Smith, and we look forward to the rest of this week as we welcome more students back and then bring everyone back at the end of the week. And we just feel like we're ready for a very successful school year, and we're going to navigate these challenges and keep students learning.
You bet. As we learned last year, working together in a collaborative manner, we can overcome anything. Largest school district in the entire Midwest last year to be open for in person instruction each and every day, never closed a school, never closed a grade level. Um, and we certainly hope that that will be the case this year. I know working together, we can make that happen for the benefit of our students.
Okay, well said. Good way to end this podcast. Thanks so much for joining us. We hope this was helpful information. We'll do this again in 2 weeks following the next school board meeting. Thank you, Dr. Smith.
Thank you.